thank you for joining us tonight on The Big Story. I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. Tonight we're looking at the possibilities of an election in a demo-charged atmosphere with just over 2 weeks left to the repeat presidential poll. The National Super Alliance has intensified its nationwide anti-IEBC protests to 3 every week, up from 2. The opposition demonstrations are informed by NASA's push to have some IEBC officials out of office, beginning with the CEO of the commission, Ezra Chiloba. Now, efforts to have both NASA and Jubilee presidential candidates on one table have seemed futile up to this point after Uhuru Kenyatta declared he will not talk with his rival Raila over the stalemate. NASA has sustained their claim that there will be no election on the 26th of this month. Jubilee says they are ready to have Uhuru Kenyatta sworn in for a second and final term should NASA boycott the election. Let's listen to NASA flag bearer Raila Odinga.
Tuko tayari kurudi kwa uchaguzi tena, ambayo ilikuwa ni sarakasi, itakuwa ni sarakasi. Hatuko tayari mpaka mabadiliko yafanyike na IEBC.
All of this while the IEBC has been proceeding with their poll preparations. So tonight we will be discussing just what it takes to stall an election, what it would take for us to not have an election on the 26th, and more importantly, what would be the implications of that. In studio today, I will have an electoral law expert, Felix Owor, who will enable us to break this down for us from the legal perspective. We will attempt to understand all of the legal provisions around this issue. If we're in a constitutional crisis, he will be answering that question as well. We'll also be hearing from politicians from either side of the political divide. That's Caleb Kositanyi, who's the Member of Parliament for Soy constituency. Jared Okello, who represents the people of Nyando, will be joining us from Kisumu tonight. We'll also have our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, who is at our city center studios here in the capital, Nairobi. So we'll have all of those. But first, as usual, let's start off with our lead reporter tonight. Sophia, much has been said about this election. We've got just 2 weeks to go. Maybe 2 weeks and a day or two. But a lot besides a boycott. We've been hearing NASA with the refrain that there will be no election unless reforms happen. So let's start by talking about that scenario first. No election, what would that mean from the experts you've been speaking to?
Good evening, Yvonne. No election is what we've kept hearing from those rallies. And let's look at what the law says. You have Article 81E talking about what an election should look like. And it talks about it taking place in an environment that is free from violence, free from intimidation, free from improper influence. So you have been seeing these demonstrations happening, some of them in some instances getting a little bit violent. So if that escalated, one could go to court and argue that this election did not take place in as far as the provisions of the Constitution state. Then Yvonne, as well, there's Article 138, 2 of the Constitution as well, that talks about the presidential election taking place in all the constituencies in the country. And we have 290. Of course, there's one as well for the diaspora. But you also have the Court of Appeal in the Minor Kai versus IEBC affirming this particular provision of the Constitution, saying that an election must take place in all the constituencies for it to be deemed to have taken place. So, for instance, if in one constituency some goons or individuals came and destroyed all of the material and an election in that constituency did not take place, then again, you have a scenario where there is no election. So those are some of the situations, Yvonne, when we hear the political class and their supporters talking about no class. Perhaps these are some of the scenarios they're looking at, Yvonne.
Yeah, but there's also another one, because President Uhuru Kenyatta is on record as saying that Raila Odinga does not want to participate in the election and will not. And then, you know, in the beginning of this whole conversation about whether we will have an election or not, there was reports that Raila Odinga might consider boycotting, but then they've gone back on their word. So let me ask you this. The event that any of the candidates, and it may be Raila Odinga or Uhuru Kenyatta, who decides they will not participate, what does the law say about not participating, withdrawal, boycott? I mean, these are all terms that we're starting to grapple with.
Yes, Yvonne, boycott is a word that we heard from the political class, at least from NASA, speaking about Raila Odinga boycotting. But we have seen since very careful words being used in as far as they're engaging, saying they will not participate in an election, in essence saying withdrawal. And one of the scenarios to consider in what this would mean and the implication of the same is a 2013 Supreme Court directive following an advisory that was sought by the Attorney General at the time. And the Supreme Court talked about several scenarios of what would happen if a candidate withdrew. And I'll read, they talked about if a candidate dies or abandons the election before the date of that elections, then provisions of Article 138(1)(b) would come into play, and continues to say this would in essence mean fresh nominations. But what's interesting, Yvonne, if you look at the Constitution, there is no Article 138(1)(b). There's just 138(1). So that has been contested in as far as the Supreme Court in its advisory at the time. Was it a typo? Did it get it wrong? And if it did, does it still stand as interpretation of the court? And then further, also to just look at what 138 itself does say, it's if only one candidate is nominated, then the person will be declared president. So in this particular case, those perhaps that would argue that then if one candidate pulls out the election, or the person who, for example, if Raila pulled out, Uhuru Kenyatta would declared president, there's a question of nominations. Those have not taken place unless the ones that took place before 8th of August. However, there are those that look at it this way. The gazettement by IEBC of this fresh poll can be considered as a nomination, so that if any of the candidates, according to some regulations in the elections law we've been looking at, indicate that if a candidate intended to withdraw, Yvonne, then 3 days after the nominations, they should write to the returning officer expressing their desire no longer to be, or their lack of desire to be party to that election. And that is Regulation 52(1) of the elections law. So quite a number of scenarios to look at. But also, Yvonne, going further in what this regulations touch on in as far as candidates who choose not to be party, you have Regulation 52(2) saying candidates shall remain and shall be declared duly elected if they're the only ones that remain in the race in accordance to Regulations 53. I know I'm moving a little bit too fast here. I hope I'm not losing anyone. So Regulation 53 is also talking about if at the close of the nomination only one candidate is validly nominated, then the one who remains is declared as duly elected. So the question and the tricky part here is, how do you interpret nomination? Because we've not had fresh nominations since the fresh poll was announced by the Supreme Court. But then you have had that Gazette notice. So Yvonne, quite a number of different scenarios here, but we'll be seeing how they will be playing out in coming days.
Yeah, absolutely. Sophia, thanks. Yes, it can get a bit murky when you take a look at the laws put together with the regulations in the Electoral Laws Act in the country, and we will be getting some more clarity on that when we speak to the electoral law expert we have with us today, Felix Owor. So thanks for that. It's honestly an interesting conversation, an interesting legal one. And you know, every time you talk about the law, there's arguments for on either side that sometimes can be defended by lawyers to such a convincing stand. But thank you for that, Sophia, for laying that down for us. That is, of course, our big story today. No elections or elections. If we have an election, well and good. If we don't have an election by the 26th, what then happens after the 31st? Sophia Wanuna, who's our lead reporter tonight, just laying down the basics for us. We will get to our electoral law expert in just a moment. But of course, the natural point to begin will be with the Member of Parliament from Nyando, who is in ODM. And I'm hoping we can speak to him now. He's joining us from Kisumu, where he was part of the protest, the anti-IEBC protest that took place in Kisumu. So, I'm told we will pick him up later. It would have been the natural place to begin. However, let's speak to Caleb Kositanyi first, Member of Parliament for Soy. Caleb, what are your thoughts on this whole issue tonight? We know the Jubilee party has said ready for the election, ready for what comes on the 26th. On the other hand, we have, NASA saying they're not ready. I'd like to speak to Caleb first.
Yvonne, I think we as Jubilee, we have said, and our party leader and deputy party leader have stated categorically that we are ready for elections on 26th. You've seen us hitting the campaign trail. We are abiding fully by the ruling of the Supreme Court that elections must be held within 60 days. I don't think there were any other conditions that were set. As per the Constitution, we are fully ready. We know that our brothers in NASA are craving for attention and trying to give us so many reasons why they don't want to participate in the election. But we are ready for the elections, and we urge our brothers to be ready. And if not, then the honorable thing to do is to write a letter, put it in writing that they are not ready for the election, like we've seen Raila Odinga has just said that he's not going for elections. Then let him put it in writing, and we swear in Uhuru Kenyatta, and Kenya moves on, because the country really needs to move on. We've had this stalemate for long, and I don't think it is good for business. It's not good for the peace of our nation. We've seen the so-called peaceful demonstrations turn violent, and as a country, we need to move on, and I think we need to focus on the 26th. Let us pray for peace. Let us get geared up for the elections, and then we proceed.
All right. I'd like your comment, though, on that petition that's been taken to court by a member of Jubilee, essentially compelling Raila to be on the ballot. So some say, okay, maybe to avert some sort of constitutional crisis. But then on the other hand, saying, would you be in a position to compel a candidate to be on the ballot? I mean, there could be a number of reasons why, including the candidate himself saying, I don't want to be a part of this process anymore.
Well, I think the main reason of that petition is not actually to compel Raila. It's for him to commit that he is ready for this election. And
what's the difference, sir?
Yes, for him to commit that he's not ready for this election. And if not, let him put it in writing. We want a commitment, a firm commitment in writing, not these press conference commitments that are not backed by, that cannot be taken to court, or you cannot take it as a legal position. But Caleb, we want his legal position. Caleb,
I'd like to ask what, in your view, would be the difference? Because you say it's not compelling him, but it's asking him to commit and to do so in writing. What in your view would be the difference?
Yeah, the difference, Yvonne, is that Raila Odinga is actually being naughty and being cheeky. He is not ready for the election. He doesn't want an election for the simple reason that he knows the numbers will remain the same. If not, it's going to be worse, because we've seen people disembarking from the NASA caravan and joining the Jubilee caravan. So,
all right, with
the reason of going to
my
court,
question, Caleb, though.
Yes, the reason for going to court
yes.
is for us to have Raila make a commitment to Kenya that yes, I am ready for elections, or no, I am not ready for elections, and we want to have it backed in law so that we don't have a stalemate.
All right, but say, for example, for purposes of argument, he does commit in writing, as you say, today. There's 2 weeks to go, and tomorrow, 2 days from now, he decides he's not ready.
Well, if he's not ready, then I think we just swear in President Uhuru and we move on. Kenya moves on.
Yeah, but what would the purpose of going to court to then compel him to? Because you can compel somebody today, and circumstances can change tomorrow, the day after, including the day before the election or the election itself.
You see, the reason why we want to compel Raila is to avert chaos in this country. We have seen the line that he's taking. He is going to thrive on chaos. The police are being brutal to protesters and all. They're looting people's businesses without shame. They are busting pipes which are buried underground, which have nothing to do with the elections. We really don't want that to happen. So the reason of going to court is to have a legal position whereby if Raila causes chaos in this country, we can take him to court and hold him accountable for whatever happens.
All right, okay. I'd like us to listen to electoral law expert Felix Owor on this issue. I'd like to pick up from right there where we've left off with Honorable Caleb Kositany, talking about compelling a candidate to be on the ballot, or, as he puts it, is to make sure that he commits to being a part of the process. What are your thoughts about, this, legally speaking?
Well, thank you very much. And let me state right from the outset that the 2010 Constitution, one of the reasons why it has been hailed as the most transformative and progressive document is because of the elaborate and substantial chapters that it gave on elections and representation of the people in particular. It pains me time and again when I see politicians argue, and the point is that they've not quite internalized the progressive elements of the 2010 Constitution insofar as the issues of elections are concerned. And let me also state that the closest we've gone to causing chaos, as Mheshimiwa said, or the closest we've gone to a civil war in this country, is when we had a shambolic election in 2007. And this is a reality that we must remind ourselves of. It is not peace at the expense of justice, but it is justice and peace at the same time. Now, let me say this. One, there is absolutely no law in this country that compels a candidate to participate in an election. The situation would obtain differently in Brazil, or in Belgium, or in Turkey, and countries that have compulsory voting. So there is absolutely no reason, no court that can compel any candidate, and the Prime Minister Raila Odinga included, to participate in an election. But let me address you specifically to a point that you raised earlier and that Sophia alluded to. What happens if a candidate withdraws? Or if, as NASA said, and Prime Minister Raila Odinga has indicated time and again, if he withdraws from participating in the repeat election on the 26th of October 2016. And Yvonne, today you'll allow me to make reference to both the Constitution and certain judgments. The Supreme Court dealt with this issue in 2013 ruling, the petition number 5 of Raila Odinga in 2013. And two specific paragraphs, paragraph 289, that talks of who is allowed to participate, the nature of the fresh election, who is allowed to participate, and the question of nomination. The Supreme Court held then that since that election would proceed from the Supreme Court decision to invalidate an election, it therefore means that only the candidates who participated in the first election, and in this case, the elections of August the 8th, would participate in that election.
Okay.
And then, in terms of nomination, the court held that the candidates as nominated then would stand nominated for the purposes of the repeat election.
All right.
And the most important paragraph is paragraph 290. And it reads as follows. Suppose, however, that the candidates or a candidate who took part in the original election dies or abandons the electoral quest before the scheduled date, then the provision of Article 138, the original judgment, it was 138(1)(b), as Sophia pointed out.
That it doesn't exist.
But the Supreme Court on the 6th of May 2013 submitted a correction to their order. And they said that the specific reference would be 138(8)(b) in the correction, the order of correction that the Supreme Court wrote. I don't think you have it, I have it here. That the Supreme Court wrote on May 6, 2013. The provisions of Article 138(8)(b) reads as follows. A presidential election shall be cancelled and a new election held if B, a candidate for election as president or deputy president dies or on before the scheduled election date. Now, in the 2013 judgment, the Supreme Court expanded the parameters of their interpretation beyond death and included abandons. Abandons is the same as withdrawal.
Okay.
If you apply that provision and that judgment, then if a candidate abandons or withdraws, then there is no election on the 26th. That is a legal position.
All right. Let's listen to Jared. This is an interesting one. Jared Okela, who's the Member of Parliament from Nyando constituency, joining us from our studios in Kisumu. So, Jared, it's been an interesting day. You've been part of the demonstrations today. No elections if there are no reforms is what we're hearing from NASA. So what will happen if IEBC does not yield to your irreducible demands? Will Raila withdraw? Will there be no election? Because that's what we hear. I'd like your interpretation of what no election would mean.
Well, thank you, my sister Yvonne, and jumbo to my colleagues in studio. Well, Yvonne, firstly allow me to express my disgust on what transpired today in Kisumu during the most peaceful demonstrations ever within the Republic of Kenya. The police, in their characteristic brutality, attacked journalists who were actually doing nothing but to cover the news on behalf of the Kenyan citizens. That has never happened anywhere, even in war-torn countries such as Somalia and many others, when the members of the press, together with the Red Cross or United Nations employees, never have we ever seen any kind of brutality meted on any single member of these organizations. So what happened today is quite absurd. Jubilee with its police must restrain from such conduct for the benefit of this nation. Now you have asked me a very fundamental question. Supposing there will be no elections on 26th, and first let me confirm that from the standoff and the gridlock that we experience today, there will be no election on the 26th. That everyone can take to the bank, that it came from Nyando, Member of Parliament. But, you know, I have heard my colleague in studio, sadly I didn't listen to get to know their names. He was trying to explain something, that in the event that Raila Odinga withdraws for any reason, then they will proceed to swear in Uhuru Kenyatta. Article 138 of the Kenya's Constitution talks about days preceding a general election, not an election that has been ordered courtesy of the Supreme Court in line with Article 140 of the Kenya's Constitution. And it said that if a candidate, firstly, at the end of the day, only one candidate is nominated. For instance, all coalitions and all political parties do not present any other candidate, and only Uhuru Kenyatta remains as the sole candidate, then of course he will be declared as so, and a swearing-in ceremony shall be conducted. On the same breath, under Article 138, it says that if one will withdraw days preceding a general election, then a similar situation or a similar fate will befall the incumbent president or the remaining candidate as such. So we are in this state courtesy of a Supreme Court ruling, Yvonne. The Supreme Court, having seen or found illegalities and irregularities perpetrated by IEBC, ordered the same IEBC to conduct elections within 60 days. If you count from the time that determination was made, it will expire on the 1st of November 2017. Now, if you look at, therefore, what happens in Article 139, which actually envisaged a vacancy in the office of the presidency. And you know, when we talk about vacancy in the office of the presidency, we talk about the president and his deputy. And you know, the Supreme Court decision touched on those two individuals. Okay. So with the elapse of the Supreme Court determination of the 60-day window, that vacancy, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, carry on.
Yes. That vacancy will be created. There will be no president on the 1st, and subsequently there will be no vice president or deputy president on the 1st of October.
Right.
And that particular article, 139, states clearly, Yvonne, that the Speaker of the National Assembly will hence assume office for a period of 60 days, upon which another round of election shall be held. And this is what is going to happen, Yvonne.
Okay.
In such a situation, it will now be another open-ended game for any political party, for any other candidate to come into the scene to participate in the next round of election.
Okay.
It does not limit Raila Odinga and President Uhuru Kenyatta, as the Supreme Court decision of 2013 did state.
All right,
so
Jared,
what we are going to see...
Jared?
Yes, Yvonne.
I'm sorry, I would like to interrupt you because I want us to take a commercial break. This is obviously a very legal question that we're handling tonight. If you don't have your constitution, please make use of this break to get one copy for yourself, because we're referring to a lot of articles in the Constitution tonight on the big story. And our big story, of course, remains whether there will be an election on the 26th. If not, are we staring at a constitutional crisis? Jubilee doesn't seem to think so. We also have some sound bites from the Attorney General of the country who was speaking on this issue. We'll be playing that to you next, and I'll continue to speak with all my guests tonight. Caleb Kositanyi, who's a Member of Parliament for Soy, Nyando MP Jared Okello, and Felix Owuor, who's an electoral law expert. We'll be back with all of them and you and your constitution after the break.